Well, I'm going to start by showing you a couple of photographs. This is a typical ranchland farm in New Mexico. Although this is typical of cattle farms you'll find all over the world, in North America, South America, Africa, and here in Australia. That's the farm next door. And those two pictures were taken on the same day. Those two farms have exactly the same rainfall. The second farm, which you can see, is increasing biodiversity, obviously, but it's also increasing its yields, it's reducing its costs, and if you worry about climate change, it's sequestering thousands of tons of CO2 into the soil every year. I'm going to return to these two farms a little bit later in the talk because I think they say something quite profound about how we approach the future. And when we think about the future, of course, you may have heard that the world has a few problems. Climate change, energy crisis, poverty, economic meltdown, population growth, resource shortages, Andrew Lloyd Webber, I mean, I could go on. But of course, the biggest threat to our future is not that we face challenges, is it? I mean, we've always had challenges, whether it was fascism, smallpox, or today, Justin Bieber. The problem is not that we face challenges, it's when we think that we can't deal with them. That's when we have a real problem. I mean, we did beat Hitler and we did eradicate smallpox, and with your help, I believe we can do something about Justin Bieber. I had a great slip of the tongue earlier in Sydney. I said we can eradicate smallpox. And lots of women in the audience went, fantastic, when do we start? Anyway, so we can deal with these grand challenges, and the reason I know that is because I spent 18 months, I don't know why I put 17 years in, but I spent 18 months researching this book called An Optimist Tour of the Future. And it's a title that surprised quite a lot of people, not least me, because I didn't actually start off writing a book with that title. Originally, when I was talking to my agent and to the publishers, it was going to be called A World Tour of the Future. It was simply a book that I wanted to write to try and make sense for myself of this rapidly evolving world that we have. What's biotech? What's nanotech? What's happening to the climate? Can we do anything about it? Where's the internet taking us? Are the robots finally coming? Are we getting back to space? Can we do anything about One Direction? You know, important questions about the future. But the title of the book has changed because during research I saw so many opportunities for a much brighter future. And I have to be honest, that really surprised me. But the title, of course, has also become a problem. Because as soon as you associate yourself with the word optimism, a lot of people instantly dismiss you as some kind of rose-tinted spectacle-wearing buffoon who hasn't understood the grand challenges that the world faces. And so I want to stress at the outset that my position is really quite simple, which is that we must have an unashamed, and I use that word advisedly, unashamed optimism of ambition about our future. And then use our best creative and critical skills to try and do something about it. So have good dreams and then work hard to make them real. Now this is not new thinking, this characterised the Renaissance, it characterised much of the Victorian age, the idea of a human project that we could make things better, but it has fallen out of fashion, particularly in England, a very cynical bunch in England, you know, and the idea that you can be optimistic, that the world can be better and you've got a role to play in that, it's actually outside of culture. And that's, I think, sort of a dangerous fait accompli. So I like to say that the Renaissance needs a bit of a renaissance. So as part of my journey researching the book, I went down to the Mojave Spaceport, deep in the California desert. This is the place where the commercial spaceflight industry is literally getting off the ground. Virgin Galactic, you've seen lots of press releases from them operating out of there. And people are building space planes in sheds and getting into orbit for a fraction of the cost we've become used to expecting. Let me tell you a little bit about the people down at Mojave. They are lots of ex-military types, lots of ex-fighter pilots. They hunt, shoot, fish, they swear prodigiously, they're fiercely right-wing. They would regard Donald Rumsfeld as a bit of a wishy-washy liberal. And while I was there, I met this guy, Dick Root. Dick Root is arguably the world's finest aviator. If you know anything about aviation, you'll know his name. While I was talking to him, three people came and asked for his autograph. He's like the boner of aviation. And he's an ex-fighter pilot, he's been shot down a number of times. And he's perhaps most famous for flying this plane, not this plane, it's obviously a model. But that'd be a rubbish achievement, wouldn't it? I flew that. No. This is a model of a plane called Voyager, which he flew around the entire Earth without landing on one tank of gas, without any fuel. He's now down at Mojave as a test piloting high-performance aircraft. He's 74. And you get the feeling that he'll still be doing that in another 74 years by sheer force of his personality. He really is a force of nature. Incredible bloke. And I was very lucky to spend some time with him. And during our conversations, he said something to me truly profound. And it's a subtle one, actually. And so I've written down exactly what he said here in my notes, because I want to make sure you get the nuance. Stephen Hawking is a prick. You're telling me I can't go faster than the speed of light? Oh, fuck you. Never look at the limitations of anything you ever comply with. Only look at it as an opportunity for greatness. Now, Dick also told me that what fighter pilots use for birth control is their personalities. The first lesson here, of course, is never take Dick out for a drink with a physicist. But I do take to heart the second lesson. Never look at the limitations of anything you ever comply with. Only as an opportunity for greatness. I like that, because look at our public discourse. I mean, if I recall the story of the future I'm used to hearing since I was a boy in our press and in our politics, it goes something a bit like this. The future is not going to be very good, especially if you vote for that guy. It was better in the old days, things are moving too fast, your job is at risk, the generation below you are feral and dangerous. You can't trust left-wingers or right-wingers or what you believe of your neighbour or religious people. Get your head down, buck the prevailing trend, vote for me, buy my paper. I understand. It's not very inspiring. Let's be frank. What's worse about that story is I can't remember a time when I haven't been hearing it. And in this context, in the context of that narrative of the future, optimism is seen as naivety. And I'm going to show you why it's not. Right, do you want to see? You went around there, and then all the way around there. That's very nice in front of you so close. Just so that nobody would draw attention to you. Good. Are you all right? Comfortable? Okay, good. Excellent. What's your name?
Brian.
Everybody looking for Brian around the floor. So, Brian, as I was saying, thanks for turning up. It's so good that you can make it. So, in this context, in this narrative of the future, optimism is seen as naivety. And I say, I'm going to show you why it's not. But if we are going to make a better future, if we are aiming at the future that we need, and the future that we want, and the future that our children deserve, we are going to have to let go of some accepted wisdom, to disenthrall ourselves of ways of thinking we've become accustomed, to get a reboot. And I know I had to. I got several when I was researching this book. So one of the reboots involved understanding a story. And it's a story that we're all part of. But it's so long and it's so big and that we tend to forget that we're in it. And it starts here with the Big Bang. This is obviously a picture of the Big Bang. You can't get pictures of the Big Bang. This is obviously a representation of the Big Bang. But 15 billion years ago, the universe pops into existence. And then over a period of, I think it's about 10 billion years, we get star clusters, including the one that includes our sun, and around that, the early Earth starts to form out of the debris left over from the sun's formation. After a few billion years after that, we get the early Earth with the primordial soup, and in the primordial soup are these things called amino acids, the very building blocks of life, the molecules that make up all of us. And over a few more billion years, these things organize themselves into cells, and inside these cells there is an extraordinary molecule called DNA, which is able to code what life is and allow organisms to exchange or pass on the code of how they build themselves. Quite incredible molecule. Anyway, eventually these cells start to organize themselves into what biologists would call simple multicellular organisms, like this algae here. And then over a few more million years, we go from simple multicellular organisms to complex multicellular organisms like this. And then something really extraordinary is happening at the same time, because we've got now this society of cells, but these beings start to form societies of their own. So you've gone from societies of cells to societies of organisms. And of course, the organisms start getting even more complex. You know, you get things like this, you get things like this. Until you get a creature that looks like this. And inside this creature's head is a particular society of cells that looks like this. And this incredible thing gives birth to a whole new kind of evolution. Cultural evolution. The evolution of society through ideas and technology. And it's evolution that, like biological evolution, will tend towards increasing complexity. Increasing complexity of technology, trade, until you get Shakespeare, Shanghai, Shakira, shampoo, and shovels, and share trading. And here we are. This process is not over. I'm going to show you something of what comes next. This lucky lady is Caitlin McNamara. She's not lucky, she's being kissed by George Bush. That was a ridiculous thing to say. Being kissed by an idiot, how lovely. No. She's lucky because she's one of the few people in the world to have had two bladders. The one she was born with, which was diseased, and gave her all sorts of trouble. And the one she has now, which is a fully functioning, healthy replacement grown by taking stem cells out of her existing liver and using those to grow an entirely, fully functioning bladder in a laboratory and implant that back into her. A whole replacement body part made from her own cells. She's not the only person to be wandering around the world with replacement body parts. This is her doctor. This is Anthony Atala, and he runs the Wake Forest Institute of Regenerative Medicine in North Carolina. He's currently growing 22 types of human tissue in the lab, not just bladders, but lots of other interesting things as well. Now, at the same time you have this stem cell revolution going on, you also have the genetic revolution. So, some of you probably remember the bit around about 2000, 2001, big announcement where we sequenced the first human genome. That cost $100 million. And that investment actually was laid on top of $3 billion that was spent by the competing publicly funded effort. It was just over a decade ago. Today there's a man at Harvard called David White who reckons he can do a complete human genome for $30. And we know that we can probably do it commercially now at least for $3,000. Okay? This is what's happening to genome sequencing costs. This is the logarithmic scale. Genome sequencing costs are now outstripping Moore's law, the law we used to describe the exponential growth in information technology. Genome sequencing is now outstripping that law by a factor of 4. Which means that the $1 genome is less than a decade away. So that takes us to a place where you don't sequence, say, a genome, but you might take several cells from a patient and sequence them all to see what's happened to that patient. In fact, that's already been done at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute in Cambridge in the UK. They took 2 cells from a cancer patient, they sequenced them both. One cell was healthy, one had been affected by the cancer, and they were to see exactly what the cancer had done to the patient. So this moves us on from a diagnosis which says, I'm sorry to tell you you've got cancer, to a diagnosis that is, you'll be pleased to know we've sequenced your cancer with a whole set of treatments specially designed for you. So I talked about genetics, I talked about stem cell biology, and of course these things don't exist in isolation. You start to see this interesting mashing up, or smashing together of ideas. So there are plenty of diseases that are genetically determined. That's literally in your genes. If you get them, you can change your lifestyle, you can take as many drugs as you like, you're still going to get them, and you're still going to suffer the consequences. A good example is Huntington's disease, which famously killed Woody Guthrie. Like most of the people who had this disease, he descended slowly to death, losing his ability to concentrate, his ability to coordinate himself, a particularly cruel end for a musician. So this is genetic determinism as unforgiving as Richard Dawkins in a Bible class. It's incurable. Huntington's disease is incurable. Except maybe it isn't anymore. Because the same institute I just mentioned, along with some colleagues at another university, last year were able to take stem cells from a liver, which had a genetically determined disease, something that the patient was born with, it was in their code. They took those stem cells out and they edited the genome and replaced the sequence that was responsible for the condition with a functioning sequence that wasn't. And then they grew those stem cells into healthy liver cells. Think about that. That's basically editing out the code for disease from somebody's genome. And suddenly the previously incurable starts to look curable. It's not just the biological sciences that are giving us interesting options. This chap, this is Robert Af Eckenstein. He was the first recipient of this thing here called Smart Hand. It has the same level of dexterity as your own hand. It's wired into the nerves in his arm, and it's controlled by his thoughts. And it returns to him a sense of touch. He says, it's a bit odd, I can feel my fingertips even though I haven't got any. This, folks, is basically the scene from the end of The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke Skywalker gets his hand. For real. I show Robert because you were one of the first people to receive this, but of course the technology is moving very fast, as technologies do. And this picture at the bottom, it's not starting to look like science fiction anymore. I'm sure sports fans here will recognise this man. Have you recognised this man? Yeah. Oscar Pistorius, Paralympic runner, often called the fastest thing on no legs. So, Oscar has reached the qualifying standard for the London able-bodied Olympics. And by 2016, Oscar, or one of his contemporaries, will be unbeatable by an able-bodied athlete. Because the technology, like all technologies that are in his feet, are moving much faster than normal evolution. So Oscar is no longer disabled when it comes to running. He's enhanced. And that scares the shit out of athletics officials. They have no idea what to do about it. In fact, they're going around saying he has an unfair advantage. So now being born without legs is an unfair advantage in running. What I am telling you is the next stage of human evolution is upon us. So human beings are taking control of their biology and the biology of every other species. This is unprecedented in history. It's an extraordinary thought, and it's a very scary one. In fact, a lot of people's reaction, understandably so, is to say, hang on a minute, we've got to stop doing this. We're losing the essentially human. We're losing ourselves in this march of technology. Step back, foot off the gas, not what God ordered. Einstein said, it has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity. Einstein's wrong. Trying to hold on to the essentially human by fighting against the very thing that human beings do best, which is evolve through culture and technology, is futile. I mean, whether we like it or not, this is who we are, right? You know, we innovate, we invent as a species, and we do it faster and faster as the last set of innovations give us new tools and new platforms to do something more powerful the next time around. This is an important concept because there is no other animal that does this, right? There isn't a bunch of dogs right now sat in a theatre somewhere in Brisbane listening to an author dog talk about doggy technologies invented in Doggy University. That would be cool, but it's not happening. There's always two laughs of that slide. The first one, the middle one, it's like, no, what's on the screen? So the point I'm making here is that the thing that some people think is eroding our humanity, i.e. the march of technology, is actually a wholehearted expression of our humanity. It's one of the defining characteristics of who we are. And once you get your head around that idea, I think it frees you up to think about your role in shaping the future. During my journey, I spoke to a chap called Mark Stevenson, philosopher, ethicist, does all sorts of interesting things at MIT and various other universities. And he said to me, change will happen, and you can try to influence it in a constructive way, or you can try to stop it from happening, or you can ignore it. Trying to stop it from happening is futile. ignoring it is irresponsible. Which means, and I agree with him, he's telling us that there is only one game in town, which is trying to influence change, our technology, and our society in a positive direction. So how do we go about doing that? One of the things, of course, we have to do is the next reboot. We have to reboot our relationship with fossil fuels. So I'm very lucky to sit on a board of friends of something called the Virgin Earth Challenge. This is Richard Branson's $25 million prize for any company that can, in an economically sustainable way, remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at a gigaton level. The prize had 2,600 applications. A lot of those were bonkers people in sheds, I have to say. But 500 of them were actually worth consideration, and 100 of them were actually really worth consideration. And then back end of last year, 11 finalists were announced. Here they are. I'm going to talk about two of these finalists, the Sabre Institute. But first I'm going to talk about Kilimanjaro down here. And Kilimanjaro is based on the work of my mate Klaus from Columbia University. Lovely German fellow, love Germans, some of my favourite people, very funny. In fact, if you're not doing anything later, sorry, there's a lovely lady in the audience who's a stand-up comedian and works in it. And if you're not doing anything later, go and see Life is Wonderful. Yeah. Where is it at? At the Bull and Bear Tavern, 347 Flanders Lane. It's fantastic here, it's brilliant. So Germans, fabulous people, very funny. Klaus, not only very funny, an absolute genius. He has created a machine full of this stuff. It's a chemical sorbent, and what it does is it absorbs CO2. If you put it in the atmosphere, it will just absorb CO2. That's actually not so surprising if you know much about chemistry, and carbon is a slut. It will bond with anything, which is why Mother Nature uses it to build everything, including most of you. So getting carbon to bind with things isn't that difficult. The problem is getting it off again is quite hard, because once it gets there, it likes to really go for it. No, sorry, there's just all sorts of things going off in my head. If you get the carbon off that material in an energy efficient way and reuse it, then you've got maybe an option for pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. What's great about this material is actually that's exactly what it does. If you spray it with water, it'll give the carbon dioxide back. Which means Klaus has invented a machine where you stick a bunch of these in the atmosphere, they absorb carbon dioxide, and they do it 1,000 times more efficiently than a normal tree. You pull them back into a machine, you spray them with water, and the carbon dioxide will bubble to the top as it does in champagne. And Klaus has come up with a design for a shipping container sized machine, and the estimate is that 100 million of those machines would offset all our global emissions every year. It's like a sewage system for the planet's atmosphere. 100 million sounds like a lot of machines, doesn't it? Until you realise we make 73 million cars every year, each year. But of course, you can go beyond this. I mean, get the CO2 to the atmosphere, that's a good idea, but actually, what we do with it, a lot of people worry about sequestering, putting it into the soil or putting it into the ocean, they worry about what the environmental problems with that are. Well, let's not waste it. I mean, carbon is Mother Nature's preferred building block. Why don't we use it? So in a room this size, there's almost certainly somebody here who's diabetic. And if you are diabetic, you will probably know that you get your insulin from a genetically modified bacteria. This is one of the first examples of synthetic biology. Back in 1976, a man was able to modify an E. coli bacteria such that you could actually create lots and lots of human-friendly insulin rather than having to get it from pigs. That's great stuff. And if you can modify a bacteria in its genome to create insulin, then you can modify a bacteria to make all sorts of other things, such as eat CO2 and excrete crude oil. Sounds like science fiction, except that is exactly what is happening in these pools in New Mexico right now. Genetically modified algae eating CO2 and excreting crude oil. Now, at the moment, the company who makes is responsible for this plant is shipping in the CO2, actually buying it in tanker loads, about $100 a tonne. And they suddenly realise that's a bit pointless, really, isn't it? Why don't we just take it out of the sky, where we are, and then feed it to our bacteria? And so they're looking to build something that looks a bit like this, where they'll take the carbon out of the sky, feed it to the bacteria, feed it to the algae, and create crude oil. This is a carbon neutral oil refinery. Think about that. That's a carbon neutral oil refinery. This is not science fiction, this technology exists. Now, it will take us some time to get it to commercial viability, but I've been talking with the Institution of Mechanical Engineers in the UK, we work with those, we reckon actually it's about 10 to 15 years away from being commercially viable. Carbon neutral petrol source from the air. How cool is that? Seriously, how cool is that? It's seriously cool. It's not just seriously cool because it's a cool piece of technology, it's seriously cool because the people who combat this will help battle climate change, because now it's carbon neutral, you're not adding to the carbon load in the atmosphere, you're reusing the carbon, but also you get to avoid things like this. Deep water horizon. Nobody wants any more of that. Also, you can deliver energy independence to any country that embraces the technology, because they won't have to make friends with people who look like this. More importantly, when you fall out with people like this, you don't have to do things like that, which starts to save you an awful lot of money. Those are my government's own official figures, almost certainly state. Just imagine for a second if 10% of that money had been put into commercialising carbon neutral. Then, of course, there's solar power. Okay, so solar power is reducing in cost by about 5% or 6% per annum annually, and it's increasing its installed base by about 30% annually. So solar pessimists look at the solar energy market and they go, well, it's only 1% of the whole world's market, it's never going to get anywhere. That's because they're thinking linear in an exponential world. If you take the compound interest of those two trends, the reduction in price and the increase in capacity, that puts us between 20 and 30 years away from ubiquitous cheap solar energy. Pretty cool, huh? Even solar pessimists say that we'll have grid parity at the point at which solar is as cheap as fossil fuels in some nations in 10 years. Those are the pessimists. That's all pretty good. The thing is that technology, of course, is not always the solution. In fact, technology can often be the problem. So I promised you I'd return to those two farms I showed you earlier in the presentation. So I'm in Australia, I'm in the outback with my new friend Tony and his mate Bruce, and we stop at this paddock here, which, as you can see, is pretty bereft of vegetation. And being kind of an ignorant pom, I said, well, is that the drought? Is that the lack of rain? And he said, well, look down the fence. And then I saw that everywhere I went in New South Wales. I drove thousands of miles with Tony and Bruce, and literally I saw that pattern everywhere I went. Grass outside the fence, a lot less grass inside the fence. And Tony bends down and he picks up some of the grass. As you can see, some of it's sort of browning and yellow. He picks it up and it comes away in his hand and he says, but this grass is dying, and that is the other half of the problem. Now, in order to understand what is happening down the line of that fence, we need to go back in time. And go back in time to when our grasslands, the world's grasslands, were dominated by huge migrating beasts, huge herds of migrating beasts. So one of the few places you can still see this happening is the Serengeti. And every year, these animals go on this massive clockwise trek, sometimes as much as 1,800 miles. And they're looking for fresh food and fresh water as they do. That's actually an important thing, because it means that that herd of animals will not be back on the same piece of ground for probably at least a year. And that's important because there's a natural relationship between the grass and the animals that modern agriculture has completely forgotten about, through all its desire to embrace technology. So the growing buds of most grass plants are at the base, which means if they get too tall, they start to kill themselves in their own shade. And that was what was happening outside the fence. Now, in nature, the herd would have come along, eaten the top off the plants and moved on, allowing the sun to get to the base and allowing the plant to grow again and carry on living. And the problem with the way we farm livestock is we don't let our livestock grow. We take these big herds, we split them up into smaller amounts of animals, and we stick them in a paddock and we leave them there. And of course, cow will eat the grass, And as soon as it starts to grow again, they'll eat it right down to the root. Because cows are not long-term thinkers. Which means basically they destroy their own food source. Which is why you've got that lack of grass inside the paddock. So inside the paddock, you have overgrazing. And outside the paddock, you have undergrazing. Something that would never have happened in nature. And to find out why that's really important and exciting, you have to understand a little bit about grass plants. In that they are in balance above and below the soil line in terms of the amount of matter that they have. So same amount of root matter and leaf matter roughly. In fact, most plants like this, most trees like this. And if an animal eats an inch or two off the top, then sometime later, the plant, often quite quickly, will lose an inch or two of root matter into the soil. That, of course, is root matter that's rich with carbon. Now, most of that carbon will rot and return to the atmosphere, as is the carbon cycle. But some of it will stay. Each time that happens, a small amount stays in the soil. And as Tony said to me, a little bit of a big amount soon adds up. Because there are 3.4 billion hectares of grassland on the planet. And if you increase the carbon content of those soils by 1%, and you can do that and a lot more, but if you increased it just by 1%, you would offset our global CO2 emissions for 11 years. The technology behind this incredible innovation, it is the fence. Normal farm looks a bit like this. You move it over to a system where you put all your animals into a larger herd, you create a bunch of lots of smaller paddocks, and you send them on a pilgrimage around the farm. You're basically mimicking the way they would have moved in a natural grassland within a farm environment. And the result is that. This is taken in Australia, but this is in near Victoria Falls. That's one farm. This is the farm next door. This is in Zimbabwe. Farm next door. Arizona. Farm next door. All it takes is the way you move the cattle. These farms all have the same rainfall. Costs of production are down. You don't need to buy feed, you don't need to buy fertiliser. I met one farmer in Australia using this method whose cost of production for a kilo of beef was a quarter of the Australian national average. Quarter. Which means he can sell his beef at a huge profit for cheaper than his competitors can make it. I met another farmer, bought a failing farm, and sold all the equipment that was on the farm, all the industrial agricultural equipment. His neighbours thought it was crazy. They all bought it off him. He used the proceeds to go and buy a bunch of fencing materials and 2 motorbikes. And now he gets up in the morning, gets in the motorbike, rides out to a paddock, opens a gate, watches a bunch of cattle wander through, closes the gate, and drives to the pub. He said to me, I get very tired watching my neighbours, they seem very busy. And here's an interesting question. Who do you think is the leading investor in this new technology that found? I'm asking a question. Any guesses? Well, that's a staggering thing in this room. Because the leading investors in this technology are pension funds. Not Australian ones, strangely, but European ones. Because pension funds, as I understand it, want assets that grow predictably in value over time and are tied to a real asset. And at the moment, European pension funds, via my friend Tony, a good Australian, are buying up huge swathes of the Australian outback and regreening it for the benefit of their pension holders in Europe. Now, regardless of whether it's Australian pension funds or whoever invests in this, it's good news. It's good news for the planet. There's a protein crunch happening. We're going to have 10 billion people by the time 2050 comes around, particularly in Asia, and they're going to want calories. Meat is a very efficient way of delivering calories if you farm like this. If you use our current way of farming, it's a very bad way of doing it. People seeing that say, we must relinquish meat. Well, you can relinquish meat if you want. My girlfriend's vegetarian, I don't have a problem with that at all. But don't do it on the basis of an ecological decision. We don't have too much cattle. We just have too little grass. And you can solve it with a simple system like this. And the reason I spent a bit of time on this story is because I think it's important to remind ourselves that even as we have these incredible new technologies moving forward, sometimes we just need to think a little bit differently to solve some of our grand challenges. And yet you are probably thinking, at least some of you are thinking the same thing I thought, which is, why is the farmer next door not doing this? Because he can see down the line of the fence, literally, I've seen farmers who can see the difference down the line of the fence, the difference in his fortunes and those of his neighbours. Why is he not changing the way he farms his cattle? I said, Tony, what's going on? And Tony said to me, well, these are special Australian fences. They are impervious to ideas. Which leads me on to the next reboot that we need. Because far too many of our corporations and our governments act like the neighbouring farm. They have processes and procedures and expectations about how things are that have been around since the Industrial Revolution. And those expectations and procedures and ways of doing things are their version of the idea-proof fence. It's my job a lot of the time now to point that out. You see, when we talk about innovation, we really have no problem referencing innovation in medicine or technology or in the arts, in fashion, in dance, in music. We're happy to talk about it. How often do we talk about institutional innovation? Changing the way our corporations, our governments, our NGOs, our charities work. Do we ever talk about that? It's kind of bizarre, don't you think? And it became strikingly clear to me that the rate of pace of change embedded in cultural and technological evolution is much, much faster than the rate of pace of change embodied in institutional and governmental innovation. And that mismatch is now causing us enormous problems, and we can all see it. Because we've enjoyed a period of relative stability since the Industrial Revolution. But that's all changing, and we know it. Which means all of us, particularly if you work for a large corporation, organisation or government, are going to have to start to let go of some ideas about how that's meant to work. And you're going to have to do that on a regular basis. Because the future is already here. William Gibson famously said, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And the reason is because even though we have the tools and technology to save ourselves from doing incredible things, we still have these old ideas about what work is, what retirement is, how we should be organised. It hasn't changed pretty much for 150 years. And that means the future we want will not happen unless we start to change our minds to meet it. But of course, changing minds is not easy. You know that, Brian. When I work with companies, I have tests to find out which one of them want to innovate, which of them want to innovate, and which of them want what I call innovation wash, which is the appearance of innovation without actually innovating. So companies phone together, well, we'd like to be more innovative, more creative, or more humane, or more ethically responsible. Of course, I mean, nobody phones up and says we'd like to be less humane, less creative. I mean, nobody does that. So they phone up and say, Mark, come and help us. I go, fine, great. So I turn up and I have a test to see whether they really want to or not. So I'm sat there in a boardroom somewhere, assembled management team are there. I go, great, how many rules can we break? Now, very rarely, the CEO will say as many as we need to within the law. More often than not, there's an awkward pause. And people in the room look at each other as if they're looking for permission for something. And then their shoulders sink a little, as if something inside them has quietly died. And then somebody, usually from the legal department or human resources, says something like this. Well, the thing is, Mark, we've got these rules and procedures. In fact, we've got a company manual that we'd really like to read before we continue with this project. And we spent an awful long time and a great deal of money instilling these principles and rules and whatever into the company. And we really do think they embody a spirit of innovation. So could we work within that context, please? At which point I stand up and say no, and walk out. They always call me back in, but I'm making a point, I was breaking the rule. Because trying to innovate in that context is like trying to run a race in slippers. You look stupid. And more importantly, your competitors will be dots in the distance. Rules are there to be broken. Not all of them, obviously. I'm not suggesting all rules are there to be broken. No? If you see one direction and you want to kill them, I think everybody would think that's okay. It's a basic rule. We should all embrace. Nobody's going to argue with that. If I'm going to demonstrate rule breaking by example, I think stories are much more powerful than me rabbiting on. I want to tell you the story of this man, Werner Forssmann. He broke all the rules and has therefore, in all likelihood, saved the life of somebody you know, or probably somebody's life in this room. Because he pioneered the concept of cardiac catheterization, which is actually putting something into your heart to get a camera there to deliver drugs. It's not very pleasant. If you've had it done, it involves usually having an insertion somewhere near your groin, someone pushing a large tube up until it gets into your heart. It's not very nice, but it does save your life. Now, back in 1929, when Werner came up with this idea, the accepted wisdom was you could not touch the human heart. In fact, if you did, the patient would die. He didn't buy that. He'd seen a number of vets touch animals' hearts. I thought, no, I think this catheterization thing could work. So he goes to his bosses at the hospital and says, let me try it on a patient. They go, no, Werner, you're bonkers. The ethics committee will never allow it, go out. He goes, oh, go on. They go, no, Werner, don't. He goes, all right, look, give me a patient with heart disease that's terminally ill. I mean, the worst that can happen is I'll just kill him a bit early. And his bosses, said, no, you're crazy, go home. He said, oh my, then I'll do it to myself. Let me do it on me. And they said, no, Werner, please, just go home. And so Werner did the thing that every reasonable physician would do at that point, which is decided to seduce the chief nurse. The reason he did this was because Gerda Ditzen, she had the key to the cupboard of all the surgical equipment he would need to do this procedure on himself. And so he spent many long nights seducing Gerda. Actually, they got on very, very well. Although there's a great quote from him where he said, I prowled around Gerda like a cat around a cream jug. Germans hate romantic. German theme going on there, I don't know what it is. Yeah. But actually they got on very well. She had a deep interest in surgery and medicine. They became very good friends. And he got to the point where he gained her trust. And he said, well, look, I've got this big idea. And she said, not only will I give you the keys to the cupboard, I'll be your first patient. Do it on me. So 2 nights later, go back into the hospital. Gerda finds herself strapped to an operating table. And Gerda was tapping her arm with iodine, ready to make an insertion in the brachial vein. And then he leaves it there, tied up. Goes to the next room and starts to perform the procedure on himself, because he doesn't want to hurt him. But it's actually quite difficult to catheterize yourself, especially when it's the first time it's ever been done in history. And he can't quite do it, he needs some help. So he goes back into the room where he's left Gerda and says, can you help me? She's furious, by the way. She's absolutely furious with him. But she calms down and then ties her. Eventually, she helps him push it further, and they think they've got it into his heart. He goes, great, let's get down to the X-ray. He just probably doesn't do it like that. He probably goes like this. Let's get down to the X-ray. Let's go down to the X-ray theatre, take an X-ray of this, it's been proven it works. They get down to the X-ray theatre where they are confronted by another one of their colleagues, a man called Peter Romius, who does the only thing that he thinks is reasonable in the situation, which is to try and pull the catheter out of Werner's heart. Yeah, exactly. Werner, being a reasonable physician, does the thing that any reasonable physician would do at this point, which is to kick Peter hard in the testicles. Continually. Until Peter gives up and goes and tries to get reinforcement. In the intervening period, Gerda helps Werner onto the X-ray slab, they take an X-ray, and here is that X-ray. This is the actual X-ray they took, and you can see the catheter going into his heart. Werner Forssmann won a Nobel Prize for this. It took a long time to recognise he ended up having to be a doctor because they still thought he was crazy even after he'd done it. But he won a Nobel Prize. And I'd like to remind you that is a Nobel Prize won by breaking all the rules, seducing a colleague, and kicking another colleague in the testicle. The reason I spent some time with this story is I want to ask each of you what you would have done if you were Werner's boss. Because you probably would say no. Most of us would. Because we're terrified of making mistakes, and we're even more terrified of letting the people who work for us make mistakes. So we're in this industrial age way of thinking that stigmatizes mistakes. We have an education system that does it, and our corporations and our public sector take what's left of that ability to make mistakes and innovate and tries to crush it out of us. I work with companies where natural innovators are dubbed as losers because they've been brave enough to make some mistakes. And yet mistakes, as we all know this, are the most powerful thing you can do in finding the truth. Edison said, I didn't come up with one way to make a light bulb, I came up with 3,000 ways not to make a bloody light bulb. Ken Robinson, the famous educationist, said, look, making mistakes is not the same as being creative. But if you're not prepared to make a mistake, you will never do anything original. Even Keith Richards knows this. When asked, Keith, how do you come up with those amazing riffs? He said, I just start playing until I make the right mistake. It's a profound thing to say. He's saying, I'm optimistic I'll get it wrong in the creation of something beautiful. So if you're not embracing this questioning disposition, if you're not smashing yourself into new ideas, if you're not getting out of your silence, if you're not embracing serendipity, then I believe you're going to struggle in the age that's coming. We have to break up a society where people are so specialised that they won't be able to function in a network world that we all know is coming down the line. We are in full-on battle with the machine paradigm of the Industrial Revolution, and if we do not win it, we probably will destroy ourselves. So I'd like to talk about one final reboot that I had to go through, and it's the most personal and it's the most difficult. And that is dealing with cynicism. Because cynicism has been embedded in society. Also in the UK, I have to say, we're a right cynical bunch. But everywhere I'm seeing a naysaying. The person who says that will never work. It's too hard. There's too many vested interests. That guy's an idiot. It's actually become fashionable to say why things won't work and why we can't have a better world. It's actually seen as wisdom now, cynicism. If you're too wise, you're a bit cynical. People proudly say it now, I'm a bit of a cynic. There's nothing wise about cynicism. There's nothing likable about cynicism. I like to say cynicism is a bit like smoking. It may look cool, but it's bad for you. Worse than that, it's bad for the person who's stood next to you. For a cynic, everything is a little too hard to imagine, and therefore a little too hard to do. And I've put a little slide here about how cynicism works. And yet we all do it. I do it all the time. Cynicism is a cultural lock you put on yourself and those people around you. It's both a recipe and an excuse for laziness. I tell myself every day that something won't work, but that guy's an idiot. But I've learned to realise that cynicism is in fact the ultimate of creativity, of getting anything done, of making a better future. And for me, on the end of my journey, it all came down to one final principle that I try and live by, which is you can no longer judge yourself by what you own. You must define yourself by what you create. And so, in closing, I'm running a bit late. I'm sorry, but that's Brian's fault. And obviously the advert for the comedy there. So I blame the latecomers and the German comedians for that. In closing, I'm going to say this: that I think we're entering an extraordinary time. The implications of all the technologies I talked to earlier, I didn't even touch on nanotech, but the implications of nanotech and biotech and infotech, both individually but more so in how they're catalysing each other, are going to change the way society works, and they're going to change it in our lifetime. And they're going to change our morals as well. If you think about it, exponential growth we've seen in information technology, which means that your mobile phone has more processing power than the entire Apollo space mission. That sort of growth is about to hit the mainstream in biotechnology and nanotechnology. Just extrapolate that out 30 or 40 years and think about how different the world could be. And yet, at the same time, we're beginning to see that so many of our institutions are no longer fit for purpose. And we know we cannot paper over the cracks anymore. Financial institutions, education institutions, politics, our education system, we all know they're no longer fit for the world that is coming. And that has a very important consequence, because suddenly the future is up for grabs again in a way it hasn't been for a long time. We know we've got to change, but at the same time, the tools to make that change are coming to us. A journalist recently asked me, what will the world look like in 50 years, Mark? I said, I don't make predictions. Because if you look at the history of futurism, the predictions made by futurists tell you a lot more about what was happening in culture at the time, or they'll tell you about the particular prejudice of that futurist, or wish of that futurist. But what I did say was, that I think we could have a future defined by the values that we choose. And we're at a point in history where it may be possible that those values will be determined not by physical constraints, but by what we're prepared to dream. And so we must all ask ourselves, all of us, what kind of world do we want? What values do we hold dear? And how are we, as individuals, as employees, as employers, as business owners, as public servants, as parents, how are we going to live those values and make them real? Because only then are we going to direct our technology and our culture and our society in a direction of greater good. And I am not saying the future will be better, because we are doing plenty to mess it up right now. But I am saying it could be. Everybody of good conscience had better be in that game. And all of you can play a key role in making that future, in defining new business models and new ways of working. But if the values you are guided by are not rooted in sustainability, humanity, compassion, and justice, be prepared for the consequence. We are no longer tenants on this planet, we are the landlord, and that gives us certain responsibilities that we all need to step up to. But the good news is that the future is up for grabs. How cool is that? All of a sudden, we can get our hand on the steering wheel of history. And even better news is that none of you need anybody's permission to be brilliant. And in doing so, I want to remind you of one final thing, and it's what Dick said. Please, never look at limitations, anything you ever comply with. Only look at it as an opportunity for greatness. Thank you very much.